Okay, Brittany Klingmann, I am excited to capture you as soon as you're walking in the door from a big day of work. We have like a 4 hour time difference. So you're just winding down and I'm just getting ready to go pick up my kids from school.
Yep.
But this is our third episode together, and I really wanted to cover the topic of is weightlifting damaging to the pelvic floor? Because we hear a lot of that. And I thought of you because recently, you've had some big competitions lately, and I've seen pictures of you on Instagram with your massive muscles lifting big, heavy weights. And I thought, like, I would love to talk to Brittany about this because I'm sure that not only are you coaching a lot of other of your clients or other weightlifters about a lot of these topics we're going to cover today, but just your own experience. I'm curious to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've done to work up to lifting such heavy weights. So before we get going, will you tell everybody a little bit about who Brittany is behind the big, massive muscles?
Sure. Mel, thanks for having me again. Wow. I always struggle with the bio part, actually. But if I think big picture of who am I, I'm a mom of two. My kids are now, well, soon to be 9 and 6. And I'm a physiotherapist, both or orthopedic or like musculoskeletal private practice physio, as well as a pelvic health physio. So I kind of blend those two worlds together. Um, and I'm a recreational athlete. So after my kids, like I was always active in high school and university, primarily soccer, really never like did any weightlifting per se. And then actually didn't maintain probably the kind of fitness that I would have liked through my pregnancies, mainly probably from how difficult it's to navigate the information that is available, oddly enough. So part of why I'm here chatting with you today, but navigating that information in what is right, what is wrong, what is safe, what is not, was complicating. And it actually kind of steered me more towards inactivity rather than more activity. So after my second child, both were brought into the world by C-sections. I found CrossFit, and we were actually in New Zealand at the time. And I just really loved the messaging, the kind of main focus of CrossFit, the kind of functional fitness approach that it's infinitely scalable but constantly varied, and the community piece was really big in that point in my life where I needed that support. From there, a couple of years into my CrossFit journey, I was like, oh, geez, there's something to these barbell movements, the snatch and the clean and jerk. I realized that really I was not going to become more proficient at those movements until I really learned the intricacies of the lifts themselves. So then I had found a weightlifting coach and moved over into the more that Olympic weightlifting side of things. And that's the rest is kind of history. Like that's now been 2 years of shifting my focus. And recently I did qualify for the World Masters and other international competitions, but kind of my target will be the World Masters weightlifting in August in Poland.
That's so exciting. I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thanks. It's a fun little thing.
I can't help but kind of hone in on something that you said because I'm seeing this more and more is I stopped being active in pregnancy because of all of the confusing messaging. And I don't know about you,
Mm-hmm.
I feel that's happening more and more. I think that things like podcasts, Instagram, all of that stuff is well intentioned, but it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to decipher what's evidence-based and what's not. And sometimes just the loudest voice with the most followers is what you listen to, but that doesn't mean that they have accurate information. And I'm seeing that a lot is people coming in to see me as a physio with maybe symptoms, like maybe I'm leaking, I'm having some incontinence or pain with
Mm-hmm.
intercourse, or my core feels funny, like all sorts of different things that people come in with, I would say, a problem. They would describe it as a problem. But then when you start to figure out like how much exercise you do or what do you do? Oh, well, I basically don't do anything because I'm having this symptom.
Right.
I'm waiting for the symptom to resolve before I
Hmm.
do any exercise, which I think is a really common theme now. And I think it would be great if we use this time today to talk a little bit more about a different approach or thinking about it a bit differently. Well, what if those symptoms um, could be managed more from you being stronger instead of avoiding, but that you
Yeah.
strengthen so that you aren't hitting that threshold or you aren't hitting that symptom. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's happening a
exactly.
lot, right?
I agree. It's very you think of you and I and practitioners that want to be remain evidence informed and up to date with current best practice, and it's hard for us to decipher, uh, even let alone the general public that isn't doesn't have that background. So I agree. I'm glad we're getting together and being able to maybe provide some clarity for people around, yeah, the information, the misinformation, and got difficulty kind of guiding that period of time.
Yeah, and I think I obviously want to talk a bit about pregnancy and postpartum because that's a big time where you hear a lot more fear-based information. But I think overall, you just hear such mixed messaging about weightlifting. And I think like just if we go off the title of this episode first, I think like let's
Mhm.
do some myth busting here and just talk through some of the main themes that we hear from our clients. Right off the top, if someone asked you, well, is weightlifting damaging to your pelvic floor? Or actually, how many of your clients actually question you about what you do? And are they kind of saying like, isn't that hard on your pelvic floor? What do you say to that?
Right. Um, Again, I probably go back to the statement that you just made around fear-based messaging and how harmful it can be. Um, Generally speaking, I there's a lot that we don't know, right? And so, based until really recently, a study was just published by a friend of mine, actually, and I took her course on pregnancy and postpartum uh, functional fitness for the female athlete, and Christina Prevett, and I mean, she's the real geek in understanding the research, and I lean towards people like her to help kind of disseminate that information. But the reality is there's really not a lot of evidence, especially in heavy lifting, because what they've deemed before as heavy lifting is 35 pounds, which is the bar. That's the weight of the bar that we're moving. And um, so she got together with a few other front runners in the pelvic health world and did a large sample size survey, uh, really asking these questions of people who continued to train through pregnancy and return postpartum, and lifting up to loads greater than 85% of their 1 rep max. So far exceeding this previous information that we had of 15 kilos or 35 pounds. And they again, I can't get into like all the details of um, the questions that they asked to gather information, but ultimately, in summary, they did find that it does not increase risk. And if anything, there's a trend towards benefits, health benefits, reduced risk of complications for the fetus and mom. And so it's the first starting point to start to gather more information and really help having solid evidence to dispel this big myth of, is it damaging to the pelvic floor? And so we can't make that like claim that it's protective per se, but it is our first really big starting point to dispel this strong myth that it is damaging.
Well, and I think, I mean, it gets picked on. Like if you think about, you look at someone that's lifting heavy weights, and how does that just affect the pelvic floor? I mean, there's so many
Mm-hmm.
other, like it's a shared load. It's a shared responsibility of the whole body. So, but I feel like we tend to pick on the pelvic floor, and no one's ever saying like, "Oh, isn't that hard on your arms?" Or do you know what I mean? It's kind of
Right.
like, yes, but that's why you work up to it. And I think you look at something like that and you think, well, it's like any exercise. I would never expect you to succeed if you run a marathon without training, or if you don't work up to
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, but at the end of the day, damage is a strong word. Um,
Right.
but more, looking at it more like conditioning or strengthening, or progressively loading the pelvic
Yeah.
floor and the rest of the body. Because yeah, can you hurt yourself if you start big? Absolutely. Yeah. But I
Yeah,
think we make
that's
it
right.
so the messaging is so black and white. Is it good or a bad? How do
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, like you said, it's also a sliding scale. So, heavy is a relative term
Mhm.
as well. So these individuals that are lifting heavy weights, for them, um, are exposing their whole system, like you said, to much greater intra-abdominal pressure than. And actually, let me correct that. Like, the intra-abdominal pressure, I know through the literature, is highly variable depending on people's strategies as well. So if a load to me might be heavy at 100 kilos, to someone that's deconditioned, getting up off the couch might need to generate that same kind of response to the abdominal wall, to successfully complete that task. So I know that's a very broad spectrum I gave you as an example, but um, it's really all about that whole body response, the training response. And often people who are moving heavy loads with weightlifting are very well trained at creating that stiffness of the abdominal wall and getting that whole team of muscles on board in a way that um, isn't necessarily damaging, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
but you didn't start there. Like, and you, if you would have started where you are now, you would have hurt yourself. Not necessarily
ex-
your pelvic floor. It might have been your
right.
pelvic floor, but it could have been some other area of your body. But because you've progressively worked up to the weights that you lift, your body is conditioned to be able to
Hmm.
tolerate that.
That's right. So I think I love that you say that, because recently I've been brainstorming a post that I want to do, because uh, not long ago I posted a photo that a photographer captured at my most recent competition, and everyone's like, "You're so strong," and I thought, well, geez, like, this is 6 years, and when
Yeah.
I started, I was doing a push up from my knees, and that was all I could execute.
Mhm.
Or trying to pull myself up on the bar, I had multiple bands helping me.
Mhm.
And so it wasn't a 76-kilo bar.
Mhm.
It was far from that. And it's just the slow, consistent effort, gradually increasing the challenge over time, that has led me to where I am now. So you're right.
Yeah, and it helps your body, like your body is now efficient at that. Whereas if I was to try to do, like I'd be where kind of like where you're describing you were initially with a lot of that stuff, just because I don't lift heavy weights. And so if I was
Mhm.
to try to do that, yeah, I would absolutely injure myself. And I think that like I said, we pick apart the pelvic floor, but one of the things like you'll see, there's a lot of talk around like CrossFit and weightlifting and leaking and prolapse. Like you hear a lot
Mhm.
about that causes prolapse or that causes leaking. But but and maybe if I started to lift those heavy weights, that is what I would see. Like maybe I would leak, or maybe I would start having some symptoms of prolapse, or maybe I'd hurt my back, or maybe I would injure
Hmm.
my shoulder. But I always tell people to think like, well, that all they're doing is hitting a threshold. Um, like some people will say, well, you leak because you weightlift. Or am I somehow inefficient at weightlifting and what is showing up is leaking? Like you're
Yes,
somehow hitting a
this is,
threshold.
yeah. And I think this brings up, this maybe can bridge us into another myth, or just at least speak to this a little bit more. In I see it a lot. A very large percentage of my caseload is weightlifters at the moment, and um, often, this Valsalva maneuver is, it will happen reflexively. However, often it is coached as well, of this like big air, press out into your belt and bear down. Now, for depending on your anatomy, some individuals will have greater likelihood of experiencing a weak spot as a result of that pressure mismanagement than others. So, those with a urethra and have a harder time controlling that pressure when they are not taught how to call on the pelvic floor to kind of meet that demand of air, or even how you can manipulate that brace of, yes, we would like air in the canister, but we want the abdominals bracing kind of in versus this bear down pressure. So I do a lot of coaching in how to generate that brace appropriately, with getting the pelvic floor to match the demands, um, as well as a lot of coaching around like when to turn to that belt too, and when the belt does go on, that the strategy doesn't change. You're not changing your strategy and pushing out into the belt. And often cues, just coaching that alone can change symptoms for people dramatically.
And isn't that the same as like if I was to parallel something else? So correct me if I'm wrong then.
Mm-hmm.
Would this not be the same as someone saying like I leak when I run? Okay, so we start to look at, okay, well, my first thought would be like, how do you run? What do you tell me, walk me through like some of the things you're trying to do when you run. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to figure out, because you run differently than someone else. What is your strategy? How do you do that
Mm-hmm.
activity so that we can figure out what's breaking down here, because something's happening that you are
Mm-hmm.
having a symptom. So it would be kind of like, show me how you do it, and then let's kind
Mm-hmm.
of tinker with some of the options to see if that manages that symptom. And maybe we need to strengthen something. Maybe we need to look at something that has too much tension. But I don't know. I don't know, two people will leak for the same reason. So are you
Yeah.
not saying that same thing? So that person's body's being put to the test when they run and they're having a symptom from that. You're
Mm-hmm.
saying that when someone lifts heavy, their strategy, like, because we need to create a lot of internal pressure to be able to lift a
Yep.
heavy weight. But the
Yep.
way they are creating that internal pressure happens to be a way that directs a lot of pressure downwards for that person. And
Yeah.
their pelvic floor tension is not able to meet that pressure going down, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean weightlifting is bad for them. The way
That's
they
right.
weightlift, their body's not coping with. However, someone else might be their point of least resistance out the front, like they're getting more of
Mm-hmm.
a hernia, right? Like a
Right.
so it's kind of like their strategy is more that the pressure out the front is not being met
Mm-hmm.
by the front wall. Correct? Is that
That's
what you're
right.
saying? Like it's kind of like, it doesn't mean that weightlifting is bad. The way you
Yeah,
are weightlifting is not being met by your body's not coping with the strategy that you have chosen.
that's right. And often, when I start there, right, with people, show me, let's
Yes.
see, like, how is this going down? And we will usually, get down to kind of the root drivers of it. And a lot of times it is around that strategy of bracing, intra-abdominal pressure management, making sure they know how the pelvic floor is a part of the that team and how it participates. But a lot of times, we're finding other stuff. We're finding asymmetrical hip weakness. We are finding a weak upper back. So when they're receiving the bar and they're being drawn into thoracic flexion and getting that moment of exponential increase in intra-abdominal pressure, that's when it's happening. So it's like their pelvic floor physio is upper back strengthening.
Right.
Or
yes.
hip accessory work, So I do think people understanding too that the, pelvic floor physio isn't just like in the pelvis.
No.
It's often the victim a lot of times.
It's like offloading the pelvic floor. So then,
right.
like I was trying to go back to your point about Valsalva, because I think like what we're getting at is that one of the myths is like, don't Valsalva, right? So you'll hear a lot of people say like, you should never Valsalva. Can you talk about that? Because obviously, like, again, I don't lift heavy weights, but I understand that at some point Valsalva is like necessary, right? And so, so can you talk a little bit, like maybe dumb that down a little bit more for like people like me that don't lift heavy weights, but what exactly is Valsalva? Why are we hearing not to do it, and why is it sometimes necessary?
Sure. So a Valsalva maneuver is when you intentionally like bring in air into your lungs and then close off your throat. So if we think of it like that as like a pressure valve that we can intentionally close off. And that transient closure of the glottis from the top to maintain the air that we've taken in. As the diaphragm pulls down, we increase intra-abdominal pressure. And that increase in intra-abdominal pressure creates greater spinal stiffness and activation of the muscles around our trunk to create stiffness around the spine so we can move those loads. Now, a Valsalva will reflexively occur at loads around 80% someone's maximum. So that's a variable that we can play with for individuals. Now, generally, coming back to the research or the lack thereof, I personally err on the side of conservative recommendations with my pregnant clients and encourage them to kind of break that habit of using the Valsalva for lifting. Christina Prevett's study that just came out, I think it indicated that 66% of the survey respondents did avoid. They were either counseled or just elected to, based on the information that they have, to move away from that Valsalva. So that I mean, the risk is that transient increase in blood pressure. There's question around, is there risk to fetal blood flow, right? And so really there, what you can do rather is modulate load. So you're not lifting greater than that 80%, and then move to like an exhale on exertion strategy. So you're managing pressure, but that exhale, especially if we're creating some resistance at the mouth with the air exiting, we're still getting a response or abdominal wall generating stiff, like keeping that stiffness around the spine.
So basically, if you want to move to heavier loads, like you want to train the Valsalva.
You want to train it. You want to learn how to use it, and certainly in recreational athletes, often what I find is people will turn to a weightlifting belt early when the bar gets a bit heavy, because they think that that's like this stimulus for stability, right? This brace for them. However, it only increases intra-abdominal pressure by about 10%. So it really truly is meant to be this performance aid that we tack on after that we've hit that threshold and kind of surpassed our ability to really generate good trunk control through that Valsalva maneuver. And so starting there, like coaching that is key.
So would you say then, on that note though, that people overuse Valsalva? Because I see all the time, like with people that they're not lifting heavy, they're doing more kind of like HIIT style, low load, higher repetitions, but they really use Valsalva a lot. Like there's a lot of breath hold and brace to create a lot of
Yeah.
tension. But then then you see a lot of those symptoms, whether it
Right.
be like they'll describe like the coning or the doming out the front, or they'll
Hmm.
describe leaking or pressure or pain at the bottom. Would you say that's a trend that you see? Because as you talk about it, I think that that's kind of
Yeah.
a very common thing, is that people use Valsalva. It's almost like, I always describe it as like you're trying too hard to close your eyes. Like if I ask you to close your eyes, you don't slam them shut as hard as you can. They
Right.
gently close, because they're much more finesse muscles than are some of the big muscle groups in our body. Some muscles are meant to work harder than others. And I think
Yeah.
people overcook a lot of that effort.
Yeah.
Right? Where so it's an appropriate strategy, but you'd never lift a 5-pound weight with the same effort you would a 100-pound weight, right?
Yeah. Yep, that's right. So again, depending on the client, we're doing a lot of down training
Yes. Try
and
less. Yeah.
finding that sweet spot of how little do you really need to get that elicit that desired effect, to get that position that you want. And what I find is when they learn less is more, then their efficiency improves dramatically as well. They're like, oh wow, well that was easy. Like, yeah, it's meant to be easy right now. So yeah, it just really depends, right?
So again, Valsalva is not bad, just like weightlifting is not
No.
bad, but Valsalva is a progression. Like Valsalva is more effort. It's on the scale of effort, it is meant to
Mhm.
fit towards the end.
That's right. I often, with my clients, I'll draw a triangle, or I'll draw a pyramid. And if we think of bracing on that pyramid, at the base, we want our low load, move quickly, repetitively movements. Like, for example, if I'm keeping on the theme of a squat, an air squat, we want to be able to just breathe freely, not think about what we're doing, and move and do the thing. And then when we're adding a little bit of load, so if we're thinking of keeping with that theme of the squat again, and I'm using percentages like 50 to 60% of your one rep max, if you know what that is, we can maybe then transition to that exhale on exertion strategy, where you're helping your body use the stability that it needs without resorting to that light switch Valsalva, let's turn it all on, and optimizing your efficiency there, managing pressure. And then you're getting to that 70, 80%. And that percentage will vary depending on the individual, but this is the rep range where maybe you're doing it anywhere between like 3 to 5 times. So you're being much more intentional with how you're creating stiffness, and you're learning how to use the Valsalva. And then you're getting up there to your like 2 repetition maximums or your 1 RMs, and you're using your belt. You're learning how to optimize that additional 10%. And where you fall on that pyramid will obviously depend, it'll be patient specific. It'll be individual specific. It'll depend on their story. And some people, they may tap out at that Valsalva at some point based on symptoms, and some may not. But yeah, let's move away from the story that the Valsalva is bad.
So then what would you say? So I think you mentioned, so that, because that's another thing, is you hear a lot about belts, like to use versus not to use, but it sounds like, again, like in that triangle or on that continuum, they're very helpful, but they fit it towards the end of that spectrum
Yeah.
after Valsalva.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing? So you're finding that you see a trend towards people putting that belt on as soon as they start lifting, almost like, what talk to me
Not
about
not
like,
ne-
no.
not necessarily. It'll depend on the environment, I would say, and depending on their training. I would say some, recreational CrossFit crowd, I may see individuals turn to their belts a little bit sooner load wise, but it's also a different context and environment. They're usually working at a much higher intensity and much greater volume of work. So a different state of fatigue than Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting, where it's a much more controlled environment, less volume. We're not like working at that same kind of tempo and speed, and there is a much more intentional brace with it. And in that demographic, I don't necessarily see turning to it too soon as a trend. But even there, the clients that I do see, we kind of almost make it like a project. Like, where can we make it to where you optimize your own ability to create that stiffness before turning to that belt? And in some, I would say it may even fluctuate. So I will speak anecdotally here from personal experience. I very much am affected cyclically. So I have a period around, right around ovulation, where I feel like a limp noodle. I do not trust my ability to create stiffness as well. And for that, like 4 or 5 day window, I'm using my belt much sooner. But I've learned that about myself. And again, there's no magic. That doesn't mean that every individual around ovulation will experience that same thing.
Britt, I hope you're ovulating when you go to the Worlds.
Yeah, you never know. I'll just be using my belt anyways.
Yeah. So then what would you say is the downside? So for people listening, like what's the downside then to them using their belt before they maximize their own capabilities? Is it just that they might not have the same performance, or what are the downsides? They're more likely to hurt themselves? What
I would say again that it depends on like why they're turning to that, I suppose. If it's that client that's coming to you or I because they're leaking and they're not bracing well and turning to the belt, which is also assisting in them increasing intra-abdominal pressure, then I would work on removing the belt and optimizing their midline. If it's someone else that's turning to it at the right time, it's just about learning how to use it as that performance aid versus like a brace, so to speak. Does that answer that question?
Yeah. And so then based on that, this stuff that we just talked about, if we go back to some of the common myths, like weightlifting causes too much pressure, or weightlifting causes prolapse, or weightlifting makes you more likely to leak, then I think if I was to summarize what we just said, it's more because, well, then no, that doesn't mean that activity specifically is bad or that it's causing those, but like, okay, what's going on? How are you doing this? How are you choosing to do this? Like, is your strategy appropriate to the task you're doing, or appropriate to the effort that you're doing? Or what else would you say about that to someone? Or maybe if you use kind of some examples in some of the people that you've seen. I'm putting you on the spot here because like just kind of saying like I want to speak a little bit to those specific symptoms, actually, is like that it causes pelvic floor tension, that it causes prolapse, that it causes too much pressure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I can think of a couple of clients recently that one individual was experiencing leaking. The leaking was occurring at around 80 to 90% of their maximum on a clean. And the clean, it was occurring basically at her sticking point, which is coming back up out of the movement when her hips were about parallel. And so I asked her a lot of questions first about like, when is it happening, to get that information. And then I'm like, well, do you have any videos of you recently of the clean at around that percentage? And she happened to have that. So we watched the video, And what we saw at that sticking point was that she collapsed at her thoracic spine. And that was kind of like the moment that she leaked. And so we talked about a couple of different strategies at that point, pressing kind of up into the bar with her hands to help keep, like, offload her thorax, as well as at that sticking point using an exhale. So using a kind of a pressure management strategy. And oddly enough, sometimes I think, I don't know why people think you're magic.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I fixed anything, but it took that, and she didn't experience leaking again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, that's not weakness. That's not,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't change anything. We cued a couple things that we observed. So that was one individual that came to mind.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but I think about that, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of people would hear that and they think, oh, she needs to do more Kegels, or she needs to stop lifting so heavy. Like, I think that would be the quick thing that people would think right away, is like, she's lifting too heavy, weightlifting is bad, or she needs to do more Kegels. But it's just, that was just the point of least resistance. And it was more like, how can we offload this, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. What was the other one?
And then another one that I saw not long ago as well, was a very similar presentation. Again, it's happening at that like 80-90% in a clean. And again, the clean load wise, the clean is the heavier lift. So you're just dealing with a greater number. And in her circumstance, it was elicited, rather than leaking, it was a symptom of like pressure at her perineum, or like pressure at her pelvic floor. And with her, we saw actually a lot, they call it an adductor whip. And so at that moment of time, her knees would come in. And sometimes that adductor whip, we don't necessarily do anything with, because it is them using their adductors to help them out of that position. But for her, that adduction was then changing the tension relationship at her pelvic floor, and I think eliciting as that responsive pressure. When we tested her hips, she was weak in her deep rotators, her deep external rotators, and we addressed it through some like accessory work to get stronger, as well as for her to be mindful as she was coming out. And we trained it with her squat sets of not allowing those knees to collapse in. And it really, it wasn't as quick of a fix, obviously, because we had to allow for that time for strength adaptation. But within 4 weeks, she was becoming much less symptomatic at about 4 weeks. And then at 8 weeks, she was like not experiencing that symptom anymore.
I love it. So I find it so good, such a much easier way to kind of get people to picture that through example, right? Just
right.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
for sure.
Yeah, because I think it's quick to be like, oh, that's bad, she must be prolapsing, let's stop doing that, let's wait till she doesn't have that symptom before. No, like there's something going on at that moment that we can fiddle with. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think, and what I want the listeners to know is the evidence is actually, the evidence that is emerging is actually trending that being stronger is lending itself to a kind of more resilient pelvic floor. And long term, we want to support that.
Absolutely. That's where I kind of wanted to go next. So thanks for that natural segue. But like we're talking specifically about like weightlifting here, but you don't have to be a competitor and lift extremely heavy weights. Like any amount of strengthening is helpful. But you're right, there's so much evidence now that's kind of in support of strengthening, not only for muscles, mental health, bone health, cardiovascular health, like longevity. There's so many things that it keeps coming back to strength training. And so I think, and I'm finding when people come in to see me with some of these pelvic floor symptoms, like, hey, yeah, sure, let's talk about your pelvic floor because that's why you're here. But we've got to move outside of the pelvic floor because we need to think about your overall strength to support your pelvic floor. And so
Yeah.
I find that strength training is something that I'm prescribing or helping people figure out early on in their treatment plan. So what tips do you have?
Mhm.
Given that we know strength training is valuable and important, what general tips do you have for people that want to progress that? Like you've talked about the triangle and you've talked about like kind of a continuum, but
Mhm.
people don't, like you said, you took 6 years to work up to this. And so people don't need to picture what you're doing, but if people
Yeah.
come to you and say, I want to strength train, do you have any tips on where to start?
Oh, yeah. Great question. And again, I'm going to say it depends. Oh God, the classic, it depends, because it really depends on the person in front of me. I generally, if I think of really basic principles though, often if it's someone that hasn't been doing a lot, um, I stick with quite like um slow tempo bodybuilding style movements that they can experience the muscle work where you're intended to feel the muscle work, and even intermittently, if they desire to do so, pay attention to what their pelvic floor is doing.
Mhm.
um, and pay attention to what their strategy is for their bracing and their breath. I really love to go to isometric variations of things. One of the ones I go to often is like a split squat that I get people to kind of settle into and be there and breathe. And people are often like humbled by it because it's hard. Their heart rate's elevated, they're sweating, they realize they can only hold their body weight in space for 15 seconds or so, and they want to tap out, but they had the opportunity to feel it where they are meant to feel it. And they're like, oh, that didn't hurt my back, or I didn't feel like I was going to leak, or that didn't bother my hip. And as soon as they get that like light switch moment, then we can start adding, the complexity to it. Um, Again, it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It might be uh, a total of 3 exercises that are really work a couple times a week, 2 to 3 times a week. That is a starting point for someone. And I think that's my other pet peeve sometimes about the fitness industry is they market, everyone's trying to sell something, right? So they market it as it has to be this like fast moving, complicated thing. And it doesn't have to be that.
It can be at home. It can be at the gym.
Yeah,
Like
that's
it's like
right.
always kind of like, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to do this with your friend at the gym? Are you looking for a social outing? Are you looking for loud music? Are you looking to do this quietly in the room in your house for five
Yeah,
minutes? Like I don't know, where are you at right now? And where do you want to
exactly.
get? Like that's like
Yeah,
you said I needed the social outlet that CrossFit offered me, and then I started moving towards weightlifting. No one said you have to weightlift. It was an interest of
yeah,
yours. Whereas some people, it's more like, you know what? I'm a nurse and I have my patients are getting progressively heavier, and I see the people around me getting hurt. I don't want to get hurt. Or, I think just it always, yeah, it has to be meaningful.
exactly. Yeah. So I guess you put better words to it when I say it depends. For that reason. I will start with those questions of like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what makes you tick? What makes you excited?
Mhm.
And then find a way to incorporate it into those, something that aligns with those desires.
Because I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to say is that some level of strength training is helpful for the rest of your life. So you're looking, how can I make this how can I make this interesting? And I can speak to myself and say, like I've always been one that, because of the time of my life and young kids, I need to do stuff in my garage right now. Like that's just how I need to get it in. But as my kids are getting a bit older, I said to my husband, like, I'm looking forward to doing this socially with someone. I'm gonna do something maybe different every year. Like I'm gonna go join this group with a friend, or like I
Hmm.
feel like I'm wanting it to be more social, whereas before I didn't want anybody around. I just wanted to be by
Right.
myself. And so it's changing, but I need to continue to change it so that's interesting for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll try to train and beat you at the world.
There you go. Sure.
And so then I think we've kind of answered one of the questions I wanted to ask you about are, what about the people that are listening that are having symptoms when they lift? And I think we touched on, like, find someone that you trust, because
Mhm.
um if you are being told to just do more Kegels or stop doing it, then maybe looking for another opinion.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not someone that does a lot of weightlifting, and I've often, but when I've had people come in to see me, I feel like I can give them a certain amount of information, but then I often refer out, or I'll ask
Mhm.
you, can you like help me with this? Because I can't picture these movements. I don't know what they feel like. And so I think
Yeah.
like we all have our expertise, or we all have our forte. And so finding someone that works in your area, or that has your, that does what you do. And I know that you offer virtual appointments. A lot of it, I'm sure that you can do
Mhm.
virtually, right? By watching them do things or
Absolutely.
talking them through their strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Young Kempt, we do virtual appointments as well. For unfortunately for us, it'll be for people that are in Nova Scotia. I know you and I have kind of collaborated in the past as well, where I've been able to see people virtually if they desire that on your platform as well. So that kind of opens the reach a little bit for people looking for that. But I do think weightlifting is one of those things that you want to be able to speak to someone who knows what it feels like and understands the movements for sure.
Mhm. So if we come full circle back to the title of this episode, and
Yeah.
I'm hoping it makes people feel a little bit more like they can answer the question themselves: is weightlifting damaging to the pelvic floor? I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it depends. I'm just joking.
No, I
um,
think we can say with some confidence and some emerging research that it is not. It is not.
but it's
And
like
if
anything, you can
anything,
work up to it,
it's
right?
that's right. If anything, it's leaning towards maybe being, you know, having its benefits.
Helpful. Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Anything
right.
else before we close, Britt? Tell people a little bit more about where to find you.
Yeah, cool. So I'm at Young Kempt Physiotherapy in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I work clinically in a clinic, but also 3 days a week we have a satellite location that is actually located inside of a CrossFit gym, Ironstone Strength and Conditioning. A wonderful, beautiful space. So I have the luxury of being able to watch people move in that context as well when they come and see me there.
Awesome. And also to make sure that you check out episode 13, where Brittany and I talked about CrossFit and weightlifting through pregnancy and postpartum periods. We talk more about how to modify, how to
Mhm.
stay active, but how to modify through that time, and how to build up after having a baby. That's a very valuable episode that I'll share in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again.